And Applebaum, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
You have a new book called Autocracy Inc. We've been collectively writing about the threat of populism and dictatorship for the last 10 years, and you and I have been talking about it a lot during the time. We taught a course on democracy together. Why is it that after decades in which democracy was on the march around the world, for the last 15 or 20 years or so, democracy has gone into recession and dictators really feel like they've, for lack of a better word, come into their own?
So there are a lot of ways to answer that question. Some of them have to do with the internal politics of democracies. But my new book is mostly not about that. My previous book was more about that. Um, my new book is about the ways in which uh, the former, primarily the former Soviet world, China, Iran, and several other places. I write about Venezuela, I write about Zimbabwe, I write about a few other countries, how they, after the transformation of 1989, when they spent a decade or so opening themselves up, how they slowly closed themselves back down again, and partly using our money and our financial systems reinforced and rebuilt their dictatorships. I think it was a process. It wasn't something that happened all at once, but you can date it now. I mean, you can both go back to the decisions taken in the 1990s, but there's also a particular moment in 2013, 2014 when you can see both in Russia and China a moment when their leaders say, right, if we're going to stay in power, then we need to compete with our own democracy activists and our own dissidents who are talking about the rule of law, transparency, fighting corruption, rights, human rights, and we need to squelch those ideas inside our own countries and around the world. And that's the moment when you begin to see the autocratic world kind of pull itself together and reassert its ideas and kind of join in, competing in a competition with democracy, which I have to say, most Democrats in most parts of what you broadly call the democratic world didn't notice this competition and didn't care about it, but they cared about it, and I think that's a part of the explanation. Um,
And
there's
so,
there's a
so
simpler version of that as well, I should say. I mean, there is also just Fareed Zakaria invented the expression "the rise of the rest." I mean, the world that we had of the 1990s, when the U.S. was somehow the dominant power, both economically and militarily, simply gave way as other countries enriched themselves and became competitive. And so that's that's the story.
So Samuel Huntington has this old idea of democratic waves and then reverse waves, right? Where there's been these historical moments when a lot of countries democratize. Some of them sort of manage to actually consolidate as democracies. Some of them end up falling to the wave sides and there are these moments of sort of democratic recession. Clearly, there was a big democratic wave that Huntington dates starting to the late 70s of Spain and Portugal, and then all of the Central and Eastern European countries would become democratic over the course of the 1980s, and a lot of places in Latin America and elsewhere as well. And I guess at that time, if you were a dictator, you sort of felt like you're just holding on for dear life, right? You're seeing all of your colleagues, many of your allies being toppled, and you're just sort of doing what you can to somehow hold on to power. But then that democratic wave seems to have washed ashore, right? And you were starting to see the first ones of these democracies fall. There was a moment when these dictators said, hey, we've kind of survived this moment, right? There's like been 10 or 15 years in which a lot of our colleagues went. We are still here. And then it seems like they went on the offensive. What is it that allowed those dictators to survive that democratic wave in the first place? What did they do before that new moment of self-confidence that allowed them to actually hold on? And when you're dating it to around 2013, when they said, all right, hey, perhaps we can go on the offensive, perhaps we can actually try and shore up our regimes in a proactive way. What did that entail? What did that look like?
So I think that what happened initially, and you can see this from the 90s and the 2000s, is that, again, I'm talking mostly about Russia and China, but we can, later on we can expand the conversation a little bit farther. And Russia and the post-Soviet world more broadly, I would say. They initially democratized. I mean, they opened up. They opened up trade. China began trading with the outside world. It allowed capitalism to begin. It let people get wealthy. It let people invent things. It let them build companies. The Russians, I mean, it depends which moment you're looking at the history of Russia, but there were genuine efforts to democratize Russia, to change the way the political system worked, to have some version of free elections. Initially, there was actually in the early 90s, there was quite a strong free press in Russia. There was a competitive television and interesting newspapers. And so I think they did open. And if you had asked Russians then, including some people who were close to Vladimir Putin, if you'd asked Russians then what was happening, they would have said, we are catching up with the democratic world economically, and we're also catching up politically. We are becoming more sophisticated. And you would have found people who also believed in this, the theory that globalization will bring democracy, and who were hoping that that was what was going to happen. So, and you could find the same kinds of people in China. And I met some. So there was I think there was an opening. So it wasn't fictitious. It's just that what happened is as the leaders of those societies looked around at what was happening, they realized that if they allowed this opening to continue, they were not going to be able to keep their power, especially not in the untrammeled, unchecked form that they wanted to have it in. And of course, they were also not going to be able to keep their money. So the billions that they had acquired semi-legally or illegally, sometimes hidden around the world, hidden in properties in London or Miami, they weren't going to be able to keep it if they, if you continued the process of democratization and you allowed for there to be more transparency and you let people have some influence on the political process, sooner or later, all of that was going to go. And so I think it was really an act of self-preservation that they thought, right, it's time to think harder about what we're doing. And you can, as I said, you can time it. It happens after the Arab Spring. And it also happens in Russia. It happens thanks to the 2014 demonstrations in Ukraine. So the change of the government in Ukraine, which ended a kleptocratic, very illiberal, declining government presidency in Ukraine and replaced it with a more democratic political system. Putin saw that. He saw the young people demonstrating in the streets, holding EU flags and talking about anti-corruption and transparency. And he thought, right, that's not going to happen here, and I need to prevent it at all costs. And the Chinese seem to have gone through something, kind of a similar process at about the same time. So that there's a 2013 document, maybe we'll get to it, which I talk about in the book, in which the Chinese, it's actually got a fantastic name. It's called Document Number 9. And
that sounds like straight out of 1984.
All right, Document Number 9. And in Document Number 9, they list the 7 perils to the Chinese Communist Party. And peril number 1 is Western constitutional democracy. And then also somewhere on the list is civil society and activism. Also on the list is free press. So they begin to see those things as threats to, in their case, the Communist Party and their form of power, or in the case of Putin, his personal power. And that threat, that perception is shared by others around the world. So the belief that many of them had in the 90s and 2000s, that they could maintain control through manipulating elections a bit here and there, through controlling a bit of the media, that they could somehow keep control also through economic pressure and the arrest of the occasional oligarch or the murder of the occasional journalist. That gave way when they said, right, no, we need full-on open competition. These values and these ideas can remove us from power. And you can hear that echo of that change all around the world.
So to be clear, right, in the 90s and the early 2000s, depending on which exact country we're talking about, a lot of dictatorships are already in charge. That's why the dictatorships, right? We're not allowing fully free elections. Perhaps we're banning certain candidates from running. Perhaps we're not allowing any other candidates from running in the sham elections that they hold. They put activists and journalists in jail when they threatened them. But what you're saying is that sort of at the time, they allowed some amount of openness. They weren't trying to control the internet to nearly the same extent. They were allowing certain kind of civil society groups to function. Perhaps if you had some kind of little intellectual journal, you were allowed to publish it to a few thousand people, as indeed to some extent you were during the later times of the Soviet Union, as I understand it. And then you're saying in 2013 there was a kind of phase change where they said those softer forms of authoritarian control are no longer enough. We actually need to really expand and improve our tools of repression. So walk us a little bit through what that change looks like. What does that mean for if you're a local human rights group that's somehow trying to make certain demands of the regime? What does that look for if you're a small independent publication of some sort that perhaps was allowed to some extent to function before? What does that mean for the average user of the internet, and how it is that your ability to access information was eroded afterwards?
So first of all, let me agree with what you said at first. I've been in China. I'm not a frequent visitor, but I've been there several times. And it must have been before 2010, I was there, and you could attend public events at bookstores, or in other public spaces where there was very, very open conversation. You could be critical of the regime. You could say whatever you wanted. And as long as it was happening there in that small space and it wasn't spreading any farther, it didn't seem like anybody really minded, and it didn't seem like anybody was very afraid. And in Russia, it was exactly the same thing. You could have you could even have a political party. You could have, as you say, a little magazine or a little newspaper, and you could say what you wanted as long as it didn't have any real popular appeal, or as long as it wasn't on TV, as long as it didn't really rock the boat. And that seemed to be the system up until about a decade ago. Then you began to have a shift, and the shift was slow. Again, I'm focusing on Russia and China, but we can talk about some other countries too. The shift was slow, but very very direct. So let me give you an example of a real organization. So Memorial is a Russian. It's kind of a history and human rights society. That's the best way I could describe it. They were originally founded by people who were doing research into the crimes of Stalin. I dealt a lot with them when I was writing my book about the Gulag in the 90s. But they also, their theory, their sort of theory of change was that we're going to publish histories of Stalinism, but we're also going to be activists where we see the rise of new dictatorship in modern Russia. And so they had sort of two things that they were doing at once. And they were able to operate absolutely freely for a long time. And they had some support from Russians, financial support. They also had support from the Ford Foundation. They were able to freely raise money. At one point, they were writing curricula for Russian schools about Russian history. There was a whole project that was to do with children writing about their family histories as a way of helping them understand what had happened in the history of Russia. So they were pretty integrated into the Russian political and social system, and they were a very big and influential group. And what happened was that step by step and piece by piece, they lost their ability. First, they lost their ability to raise money from the outside world. Then eventually they were named foreign agents, which, because of their contacts abroad, foreign agent sounds the same in Russian as it does in English. It makes you sound like a spy. They were, eventually they were cut off from. They weren't allowed to work in schools. They lost the building that they were working out of in Moscow. Piece by piece by piece, they lost their ability to be active and to participate. There was a horrible scene in just the run up to the war in Ukraine in the late fall. I think I'd have to check the date, but I think it was a couple of months before the invasion, where they were showing a film. They were still able to show films, again, tiny little film in a little private theater. And it was a film about the Ukrainian famine, and literally the equivalent of stormtroopers, kind of guys plainclothes policemen came in, they beat people up, they shut the film down, and they kicked everybody out, which is, if you know your history of Nazi Germany, it's exactly what happened during a showing of All Quiet on the Western Front in Germany in the run-up to the Nazi regime.
Side note, Anne, that happened in the city of Laupheim in Germany, because one of the founders of Hollywood, Karl Lemle, was raised in Laupheim and moved to the United States, I think, perhaps when he was 10 or 11 years old. I may be getting the exact age wrong. And oddly enough, this small town of about 25,000 people is where I lived for 3 years between the ages of 9 and 12. So
you know this story.
At a time. So I know the story and I know the town.
Right.
And, because he sort of wanted the premiere of this to happen in his hometown, which is a very small place in Germany. And it was obviously honoring this book, which is a German anti-war novel. And so anyway, I have mixed feelings about the town of Laupheim, which was sort of some of my less pleasant childhood experiences growing up, including experiences of some forms of anti-Semitism. And then I went back there later in life. I was invited for a talk, and I'd seen that actually the place had changed for the better in many interesting ways. So sorry, since you mentioned,
since I mentioned it,
mentioned in an interview, I had to talk about it.
I'm coming to the end of the story, actually, because you know how it ends, and it ends with Memorial being banned. And most of the one or two of its leaders are still in Russia. The CEO, the chairman of Memorial, is now in prison. He made a very moving speech on the day that he was condemned to prison, and many of the rest of them are abroad. A lot of people who I worked with and knew in the 90s, who were great experts in the history of the Soviet Union, are now in Tbilisi, or they're in Istanbul, or they're somewhere in Europe. So it actually, from being a thriving, important national organization, and to be clear, it's a Russian organization with Russian roots, and was actually founded in the 80s before the Soviet Union ended. It was a flourishing part of the landscape, and it's completely gone. It does not exist anymore. And that's the effect of the change.
Why is it that dictatorships haven't always been as harsh as they are now? Which is to say that in political science, there's a framework where you want to have as much repression as possible as a dictator, because any form of independent organizing is a potential threat to you. But repression also has costs, right? It has straightforward monetary costs. It means that you have to sustain, a very large security apparatus, and that's going to cost you money. It also has costs that go beyond that, including the fact that it is likely to alienate some of your own citizens. Famously, the sort of East German state was quite happy for its citizens to have access to West German TV, because they felt that it was a form of entertainment that mollified people in certain respects. And there's a very good...
If I can interrupt you, that's the Russians still have access to YouTube. Maybe it's going to be cut off soon, but it has been. They've been allowed to have it, even though all other social media has been cut off for 2 years, for the same reason, because lots of Russians watch movies on YouTube. Anyway, I interrupted you.
And there's at least some evidence that the underlying theory, in fact, holds. So there's a great natural experiment where you can study the Tal der Ahnungslosen, the Valley of the Clueless, which is an area around Dresden in Germany that for topographical reasons was not able to, because it was in a valley, was not able to get West German television. And it appears to be the case when you look at the slight differences between one village that had access and the other village that doesn't, because, one of the villages is a little bit higher up on a hill or something like that, that the people who didn't have access to West German TV both disliked their own regime more because they were more bored. They didn't have entertainment and access to American movies and all the things you could see on West German TV, but also because West German TV actually revealed to them some of the shortcomings of West Germany. Rather than just thinking of it as the paradise on the other side of a war where everything is better, they recognize that there's some worrying things like unemployment or crime in West Germany too. And so actually it seems to have changed people's views for the negative. So when you're looking at this calculus, clearly one way of conceptualizing the shift that happened after 2013 is that people said, we have to ratchet up oppression. We have to ratchet up repression. We can't risk the relative openness of the last 10 or 20 years. So perhaps we just now have a self-confidence and resources to ratchet up repression in that way. But that comes with trade-offs. And so what are those trade-offs looking like? And do you think that those trade-offs are eventually going to come to bite? Or do you think that these dictators are making the right choice, that they clearly have figured out how to control their countries in ways that mean that they don't have to worry too much about the downside of a trade-off that they have entered in the last period?
So first of all, I mean, you're right. What they're doing in both the case of Russia and China is very expensive, and if you add to that the case of Iran or the case of Venezuela, I mean, we have examples of dictatorships who are happy to see their country go into ruin, become a failed state, rather than giving up power. I mean, Nicolas Maduro has allowed his country to go from being the first Chavez and then Maduro from being the richest country in South America to being the poorest, and send many millions of Venezuelans have gone into exile to escape. And so he was willing to pay an unbelievably high price for power.
And just for a second on that, we're recording this on Monday, July 29th, the day after a historic election in Venezuela, in which it is quite clear that the opposition appears to have won. The governing party around Maduro has declared that they won. In one television transmission on state TV, there was a total of 108% of votes cast, with 50.2 of them having voted for Maduro. And by the time that you're listening to this episode, which is going to be released on Saturday, we will see a little bit more about how this is playing out. But while this is a moment of hope for Venezuela, there's also very real risk that over the next days, so perhaps over the course of the last days as you're listening to this, there may be considerable violence used to repress the protesters who are now demanding that the votes be honored.
Yeah. So, but this makes your point further, that for some people, staying in power is worth anything. That's worth any price. And they'll pay anything. And, the destruction of their country is a price they're also willing to pay. I mean, in the case of Russia, it's clear that the impact, even just of the last 2 years of war, and never mind the last, 15 years of ever growing repression, has been, horrific for Russian living standards. People's lives have declined. Not to mention the probably 500,000 Russians who have been killed or wounded in the war. The loss of massive amounts of national wealth, whether through sanctions or military loss. There are all kinds of ways in which the Russian economy is now imbalanced. We don't know, but even very small changes could be enough to create another sense of crisis. It comes periodically. There have been sort of waves of crisis, and so I can't make a prediction about what will happen there, but no, it's not good for Russia. I mean, the decisions that Putin has made have been good for him in that they've kept him alive and very wealthy, but they haven't been good for the country, and that's something he's willing to accept. And China is even more complex. What's the cost to the Chinese of having no transparency about investments, about the role of the state in the companies? How do we know? Do we even know how that affects business decisions in China? The impact of pressure on some entrepreneurs and some forms of business. The return of state-dominated and state-dictated economic policies. I mean, there very high prices are going to be paid for that. As I said, I can't predict whether that will lead to some kind of spectacular change, but does it cause a decline in living standards? Yes, clearly it does. I mean, will it create political problems for Xi and the Communist Party down the road? Yes, of course it will. So, that's a big part of the story. That how much are they willing to, how much are they willing to risk in order to keep their power? And I think in a lot of cases, it's going to turn out that they're willing to risk a lot.
But let me restate the question perhaps a little bit, right? So there's two ways of thinking about the costs of repression, right? Like one is the cost for living standards, for decent lives, and all of those things. And I think clearly in that sense, the cost is very, very high. And we see that particularly in Russia, in Venezuela, but in many other countries around the world as well. Um, but when political
you mean
scientists
political
think
cost?
about, yeah, when political scientists think about this trade-off, I think they're also thinking about political cost to the regime, right? Which is to say that if you tell people, hey, you know, you can't run for office, you can't go into the streets and say that you find the president of a country to be terrible. But other than that, do whatever you want, right? You can create freely in art. You can watch whatever movies you want. You can have whatever associations you want. That is a deal that a lot of people are willing to take because they say, I'm not that political. And as long as my income is good and as long as I basically can do what I want, I don't really care about having those kind of democratic freedoms, right? Once you tell people, and by the way, you're going to be conscripted in the army and possibly sent to fight a war in Ukraine that you personally don't really care about. And by the way, you're no longer able to watch the TV show that you love from another country. And by the way, even if you make some kind of relatively mild joke on the internet, suddenly, you might be interrogated about it. And by the way, now the economy is starting to crater. That obviously also increases the extent to which people are willing to take risks to topple a regime, because the number of people who are impacted by that is much larger. And I think the broader question here is that dictatorships always have this really bizarre sort of Manichaean nature, which is to say that they seem incredibly stable, right? They seem incredibly in charge because, after all, power is incredibly concentrated. They look a lot less messy than democracies do in all kinds of ways. But we know from history that most dictatorships do, in fact, fail. And sometimes they fail because the dictator dies and there's a succession problem. Sometimes they fail because there's a coup from the army. Sometimes they fail because there's a mass uprising. But there's plenty and plenty and plenty of examples of dictatorships that look incredibly stable on day one, suddenly toppling on day two. That, of course, is part of what drives the paranoia of many of these autocrats, because they know that, a democratic leader knows, I have elections coming up in 2.5 years, and until then I should be fine. A dictator thinks, well, tomorrow or in 2 hours, suddenly the army general might be in front of the palace and trying to stage a coup. And by the way, if that happens, I don't, go home and give some speeches to Goldman Sachs for $100,000 a pop and enjoy my retirement. I'm probably dead, or in the best case scenario, in exile, right? So how stable do you think these autocracies are? Do you think that when they've ratcheted up repression this way, when they start to use all these new tools of oppression, they've solved a problem in ways that previous generations of dictators did not? Or do you think they've made themselves vulnerable to new forms of pressure that perhaps we're not quite seeing yet?
So I think, of course, they're always vulnerable to pressure. And the best example of that in the case of Russia is that on the morning when Prigozhin, who was the head of the Wagner Group, who was someone close to Putin, who was a general, in effect, a general commanding an army of convicts in Ukraine, when he made his strange march to Moscow, he announced he was going to march to Moscow and do something. It was never actually clear what he was going to do. Putin went on television that morning and made this panicky speech in which he actually referenced Nicholas II, who was the last Tsar of Russia. And was effectively saying, this is 1917 and, crisis and catastrophe is about to come. So clearly he is afraid of that. That's exactly the model, that's exactly the model that he fears. But I will also say that there are things about the modern world that give all dictators, not just the Russians and the Chinese, but you could throw in a lot more sense of stability and security than their predecessors had in the past. And this is now one of the topics of my book. I mean, some of them you probably know about already. I mean, the degree of surveillance that they can carry out, not just physical surveillance with street cameras and so on, but through the internet, through monitoring people's thoughts and observations, through controlling conversations. This is what the Chinese do, and even trying to predict where political dissent might be emerging. They have there's tools and technologies they have that was just not available to a previous generation. That's the first piece. And then The relationships between one another is another new aspect. So, yeah, so going back to Maduro again. Why has Maduro been able to stay in power despite being profoundly unpopular and a disastrous, failed ruler of who's destroyed his country? It's because he's had investments from Russia. The Russians have sold him military equipment. It's because the Chinese have invested in Venezuelan companies and sold surveillance technology to the Venezuelan state. It's because the Cubans have offered secret police and training for secret police. It's because the Iranians, all the way on the other side of the world, have come to help the Venezuelans avoid sanctions and change that, and invest in their oil industry. So it's almost like there's a club of autocrats who come to the rescue in the case when their brother autocrats are in trouble, both because they want to make money there or because they want their natural resources, but also because they have, it's not exactly an ideological tie, but just a sense that when one dictator falls, it's bad for the rest of them. And it's clear that they see that. It's clear that they're willing to prop up even poor and failed, and failed leaders. And I don't think, certainly not in this century, we haven't had anything like that. But even when you look to previous centuries, when you can talk about I suppose the Soviet bloc functioned, something like that. But the Soviet bloc was also, ideologically aligned and led by the Soviet Union. This is something much more flexible and much more, I would say, even transactional. That they act where they feel like they have some common interest, and then they don't bother each other the rest of the time. But that network, those links between them, are part of what makes the current moment different. And it's also something that's been growing. I mean, even once you see these links and once you start paying attention to them, it's hard to unsee them. They're everywhere. And just a few days ago, as we're speaking, there was a Russian and Chinese set of airplanes that were found flying near Alaska, doing some kind of joint training program, which had never happened before. After the Maduro's stolen election, Russia, China, Iran, and a host of other countries, and Cuba, immediately congratulated Maduro on his great victory, so offering him legitimacy right away. They act together, in multiple ways, in multiple spheres, economically, militarily, and elsewhere. And I think that is part of what is making them, last longer. I mean, Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, would have been gone in 2020 if he hadn't been rescued by the Russians. Maduro would have been gone if he hadn't been rescued by the autocratic network. So once they began to see that as their role, it became much harder to dislodge them.
Certainly, Bashar al-Assad would have been gone without help.
Exactly,
from
that's another.
Russia
That example is also
countries.
Yeah.
What is the goal that they have? So one way you've characterized it is survival, right? This is a club for survival, for mutual support against attempts domestically or internationally to bring about regime change, and it's effectively a defensive alliance. Another way of thinking about the potential goals might be as inspired by the dominance of the United States in the 1990s, when America really was the only superpower. And it's, perhaps that's what Fareed is getting at when he talks about the rise of the rest. It is trying to say we don't want a world completely dominated by the United States. And so anybody who's willing to be on the other side of the United States, we're willing to work with in order to provide that kind of counterbalance, right? A third characterization might be a more offensive one. Certainly in the case of Russia, you might think that there is a sense of imperialist nostalgia, a sense of having lost the standing that the country once had and wanting to regain, at the very least, its sort of sphere of influence, over countries that once belonged to it formally, or once were, like Ukraine, or once were in its thrall, like Poland and other countries during the time of the Warsaw Pact, and them trying to reestablish that kind of dominant position in the region. How should we think about that? Is that different from country to country? Is Russia, which with its imperialist nostalgia, different from China in that respect? Do they all share all three of those goals? How should we think about what these dictators are actually trying to do?
I think I would make distinctions between them. I don't think they're all the same. I do think that um, um, it's true that all of them perceive themselves as in conflict with a US dominated world, and they have language to talk about that. So the Russians use the word multipolarity, which actually could be just quite a neutral word. I mean, it just means there are many countries that have power, and that's quite, that's obviously true. It's not, that's not wrong. But they use it in a specific way. They talk about creating the multipolarity as opposed to US hegemony. But what they mean by that in practice is they mean creating a world in which nothing constrains us, no norms, no UN regulations, no UN charter, no international human rights bodies, no NGOs. And when they talk about that, that's what they mean. And they use that language actually inside international institutions. They use it in their propaganda and their communications. And that is a thing they all share. So however it is they choose to speak about it. Often the imperialism or the desire to spread your ideology, the Iranians have that. In the case of Iran, it's about spreading the jihad, to other countries and creating and arming proxies around the Middle East and actually elsewhere. They arm. They've also had played strange roles in Latin America and elsewhere. That's those things are connected. They want the right to be able to do whatever they want, whether it's rebuild their empire or spread their ideology, or in the case of Venezuela, they were talking about invading Guyana not that long ago. I mean, you can, even on a small scale, and they want the ability to do that without anyone stopping them or saying, this is against international law. And part of the campaign against so-called US hegemony is about that. They want the freedom, both internally and externally, to behave however they want. And the other, and that, by the way, includes inside our country. So again, a phenomenon that I talk about in the book is the phenomenon of, whether it's the Russians or the Chinese or actually the Rwandans or others, murdering their own dissidents who are abroad. The expression usually is transnational repression, murdering their dissidents, kidnapping people, essentially committing crimes in the democratic world, which they increasingly want the freedom and the impunity to do. And so I think those, I wouldn't say that all those things are different. I think they overlap. So, and it's about being able to have that kind of power, to express that kind of power however they want. They don't think they should be constrained by us, by some rules, by some institutions, or by anything else.
How should the democratic world respond to that? And I'm asking that as a follow-up in part because I think it depends on how we conceptualize what exactly the goals of these autocratic regimes are. But it also, of course, depends on what we think are realistic goals. Many attempts both at trying to support democracy movements in those countries have failed, and then more spectacularly, attempts to actually export democracy by the use of arms, as in the case of Iraq, have failed. So, how is it that democratic countries can stand up for their values, can ensure that autocracies don't shape the international order of the 21st century, that Autocracy Inc. doesn't continue to expand its hostile acquisitions, but without falling into the kind of traps that themselves seem to undermine democratic legitimacy, bleed the treasure and, in certain contexts, the blood of democratic nations, and therefore weaken their standing in the international order itself.
So, first of all, the original reason given for the invasion of Iraq, the purpose of it and the reason and the explanation for it had nothing to do with democracy. It had a whole, I don't want to relitigate that now, and you probably have a lot of other things to do over the next 6 hours. But That was not the purpose of it. And so the post hoc justification for Iraq, that it was somehow about democracy, was really, was a tragic and unfortunate misuse of language. It was never actually meant to be about that. And, there aren't really any examples of the U.S. conquering places because it primarily has democracy in mind. It's a kind of misunderstanding of history. It's also true that U.S. support for democracy movements historically has been successful. The most famous is probably the Solidarity movement in Poland in the 1980s, or more broadly, the anti-communist movements across the Soviet bloc over a number of decades. And whether it was through mostly very cheap things like Radio Free Europe, offering people alternative sources of news, which wasn't in the grand scale of things very expensive. Those have been successful and they have worked. So I wouldn't, it's not that everything fails. It's that recently the autocrats have gotten better at pushing back. I mean, my argument in my book is that the beginning of this process, first of all, we have to recognize and understand the scale of the problem. Second of all, we need to look at the ways in which we are enabling those systems. And we need to start with some internal reforms. And I talk about the financial system, which is filled with loopholes that are used by the autocracies, the money laundering, shell companies, the tax havens that now probably contain something like 10% of the world's wealth. I mean, those things aren't part of the landscape like trees, or mountains. I mean, those are human-created institutions, and they can be uncreated, and we could uncreate them now, and that would have a big impact on certainly how money moves around in the autocratic world. We could also begin to look at our social media, and by social media regulation, I'm not talking about banning things or creating a ministry of information. I mean, for example, making the social media companies obey the same laws online that people have to obey offline. Bring some regulation in order to that system would also help. And in both cases, those are things that we could and should do with allies, and even in conjunction with the democracy movements in the autocratic world. I mean, nobody knows more about Russian kleptocracy than the Russian opposition. They track it, they understand it, they know how it works. We should listen to them. And nobody knows more about how, the Venezuelan regime's relationships to the narco trafficking than the Venezuelan opposition. Again, they know it. And I don't think we spend enough time listening to them and listening to what they do that works, and trying to understand what they do, as opposed to imagining that every conflict is a military conflict. Thirdly, though, I do think that we should, one of the best ways to make sure that the world remains peaceful, at a moment when all of these countries are building up their military arsenals very rapidly, is to deter them. And we should, this is not the moment to abandon NATO. This is not the moment to abandon our other allies in Asia, the Japanese or the South Koreans. This is a moment to remember that if you want peace, you need to be prepared to defend it, and hopefully that means you never will. So I'm not arguing for new wars. I'm not arguing for invading anybody, but I am saying that we should understand what's happening, the relationships between these countries, their ambitions, which are larger and larger, and be better prepared psychologically to fight back. And again, in an ideal world, we would be doing this with allies and in consultation with allies. And we do have allies all over the planet. There are 50-something countries who have been part of the conversation about helping and aiding Ukraine. So that's 50 countries who are allied with, more or less the broad goals of the democratic world, and we could work together. So just to sum up, I mean, internally, cleaning up our own act internally, creating more resilience, strengthening our democracies in all the ways that you and I have talked about over the years, but also being aware of what's happening and being prepared to counter it.
Thank you so much for being back on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. And just to finish by saying my book is dedicated to the optimists, because I know there are many optimistic people, even in the worst countries and the most where change seems the farthest away. And I know we have many in America, and I want to be part of their movement when it arrives.